Okay, Alok, we can start. Good morning. We are having a seminar on peptic ulcer disease. As you all know, the peptic ulcer disease incidence is going down in our part of the country also, but there are some patients we still find who comes with more of complications. So, and the exam also you'll find a long case like a peptic ulcer disease with outlet obstruction or some complications of peptic ulcer disease. So, to me, it will today is Professor Anadia Acharya is a retired professor of surgery from RG Kar Medical College. So Dr. Acharya and myself will take you through these seminar topics. The first presenter will be Dr. Chandan P, who is a second year junior resident in DNB surgery at Barasat District Hospital. Okay. So Dr. Chandan, you can start.
Good morning, sir. Good morning to all the teachers and my colleagues. Today I'm going to present the topic peptic ulcer disease. Peptic ulcer disease. It is a break in the gastrointestinal mucosa occurring in the areas exposed to acid and pepsin. So let us see what are the risk factors. Risk factors for peptic ulcer disease. The most common risk factor is Helicobacter pylori infestation. Second being use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, steroid therapy, smoking and excess alcohol intake, genetic factors, and blood group O, hyperparathyroidism, Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. It is a rare syndrome caused by gastrointestinal tumor. Now coming to H. pylori infection. See, H. pylori is an urease producing gram-negative bacillus. It is H. pylori infection is usually seen more in the developing countries and in people with low socioeconomic status. Infection increases with age and
Shafiq, you mute, please. Shafiq, you mute.
Hello.
Yeah.
So what H. pylori does is, first it infects the mucosa of the stomach, which produces an inflammatory response, giving rise to gastritis, and there will be increased gastrin secretion, which causes gastric metaplasia, causing damage to the mucosa, which ultimately gives rise to an ulcer. Increased risk of developing gastric adenocarcinoma. Next slide, please. So this H. pylori infection, how it produces an ulcer. So let's see. H. pylori produces an enzyme urease, which breaks down the urea into ammonia and bicarbonate, and ammonia neutralizes acidic environment, and which is also toxic to the stomach epithelial cell, which produces mucus. So by this mechanism, it destroys the mucus producing cells and causes an imbalance in the gastric mucosa. Next slide. Coming to mechanism of action, like how NSAIDs produces an ulcer. NSAIDs suppresses the prostaglandins, which are protective. Prostaglandin, what it actually does is, it decreases the acid secretion and increases the mucosal blood flow. Increase mucus and bicarbonate secretion, which are gastroprotective. So let's see how steroids cause an ulcer. Steroids enhance gastrin and parietal cell hyperplasia, which increases acid secretion. When acid secretion is increased, there will be diminished gastric mucus synthesis, which also suppresses the arachidonic acid metabolism, and prostaglandin synthesis. Smoking. Nicotine is a ganglionic stimulant. It stimulates the vagus nerve and increases HCl secretion through acetylcholine. Alcohol. Ethanol is known to cause gastric mucosal irritation and non-specific gastritis. It ultimately disrupts the mucus secretion and cause mucosal damage. Genetic factors. A rare genetic association exists between familial hyperpepsinogenemia of type 1, a genetic phenotype leading to enhanced secretion of pepsin. Blood group O. Patients who do not secrete ABO antigens in their saliva and gastric juices are known to be at higher risk of gastric and duodenal ulcer. Coming to hyperparathyroidism, increased serum level of calcium leads to gastrin and acetylcholine, increase in secretion of gastrin and acetylcholine. It changes stimulation of gastric acid secretion will be altered. It will be very high in cases of hyperparathyroidism. Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. It is a very rare this thing. It is a cause for peptic ulcer disease in 0.1 to 1% of peptic ulcer. Gastrin secretion from non-beta cell tumor of the pancreas. It is most commonly seen in pancreas, duodenum, and antrum, the gastrinoma. Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. It is a recurrent resistant, occurs at unusual sites. It is multiple, and it is usually malignant. It is a slow-growing indolent tumor, Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, seen in the parietal cell mass. Massive hypersecretion of acid takes place. Next slide. Gastric and duodenal ulcers usually cannot be differentiated based on the history alone. Epigastric pain is the most common symptom of both gastric and duodenal ulcer. It is characterized by a gnawing or burning sensation and occurs after meals, classically shortly after meals with gastric ulcer and 2 to 3 hours afterwards with duodenal ulcer. Food or antacids relieve the pain of duodenal ulcer but provide minimal relief of gastric ulcer pain. A few differences between gastric and duodenal ulcer are given in the following table. Gastric ulcer is usually seen between the age groups 50 to 60 years, that is in 5th and 6th decade of life. Whereas duodenal ulcer, it can occur in young individuals also. Usually seen in the age between 20 to 50 years of age. And gender ratio, gastric ulcer is almost equal incidence in male and female, but duodenal ulcer is more commonly seen in males. Pain in gastric ulcer, pain is felt over the umbilicus and left to midline, whereas duodenal ulcer felt above the umbilicus and right to the midline. Radiation of pain. There is usually no radiation in gastric ulcer, and duodenal ulcer, it may radiate to the back. Nature of pain, both gastric and duodenal ulcer, it will be periodical pain. Weight loss. Weight loss in gastric ulcer, weight loss will be present due to reduced intake of food And duodenal ulcer, no weight loss as patient feels better with eating and hence goes on eating. Gastric ulcer causes hematemesis, and duodenal ulcer causes melena. Gastric symptoms: gastric ulcer, sensation of feeling of fullness, indigestion, heartburn, gas trouble, and belching will be there. In duodenal ulcer, bloated feeling of intestinal gas will be there. And gastric ulcer malignancy is very common, and duodenal ulcer rarely goes for malignancy. Aggravating factors and relieving factors. Gastric ulcer will be aggravated with food. The pain aggravates when a person takes food, and while in duodenal ulcer, pain aggravates 1 to 2 hours after taking food, when the stomach gets empty, and usually there will be night pain. And relieving factors: gastric ulcer will be relieved by vomiting or taking alkali foods, and duodenal ulcer will be relieved after taking food. So coming to clinical features of peptic ulcer diseases, usually in the earlier stages, the person will be asymptomatic. Later on, he goes on to develop epigastric pain. There will be nausea, oral flatulence, bloating. There will be distension of abdomen and intolerance to fatty food. There may be heartburn, pain which radiates to the back. There will be chronic GI bleed. It can be hematemesis, or it can be melena. And later on, it may cause iron deficiency anemia, progressive unintentional weight loss, and progressive dysphagia and odynophagia, persistent vomiting. Sometimes there may be a mass in the epigastric region. Patients age 55 years and older with unexplained and persistent recent onset dyspepsia can also be a feature. So what are the alarming features out of these? Bleeding, melena or hematemesis, and anemia. Early satiety and loss of appetite, unexplained weight loss, as I said earlier, progressive dysphagia or odynophagia, recurrent vomiting, family history of gastrointestinal cancer. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Acharji.
In the etiopathogenesis, in the role of H. pylori, you have mentioned mainly the urease producing function of the H. pylori, but actually the H. pylori,
irritates the
etiopathogenesis is due to H. pylori. I think there's another slide. Just we put it, or maybe after it. The H. pylori, H. pylori is actually multifactorial. H. pylori produces urease, which causes urea to be broken down into ammonia. And this ammonia, as you have mentioned here, this mechanism is that, but they produce some cytolysins also, so-called vacuolating cytolysins, which has very important role and which directly affects the cells of the stomach. And it has also a mucolytic effect, which disrupts the protective layer of the mucus. And all this taken together causes pathological changes that occurs in stomach. In fact, many patients, I won't call them patients, many persons, if tested randomly, with or without any symptom, are found to have H. pylori. So mere presence of H. pylori is not really feature of any ulcer. H. pylori has many genetic variations, and those one causing the vacuolating cytolysins or VAC. This VAC, H. pylori associated with this VAC gene is very important. So not only urease, the other factors also is one of the effective causative pathogenetic factor. So that is about H. pylori. Regarding gastric ulcer and duodenal ulcer comparison, you said duodenal ulcers are more likely to cause radiation or pain to the back. This is not usually the case. When a gastric ulcer penetrates backwards, affects the pancreas, it's only then that the pain radiates to the back. Otherwise, if there is nothing to suggest this pancreatic involvement, non-specific upper abdominal involvement, pain radiating the whole of the epigastrium and is radiated back, it is usually suggestive of a gastric ulcer penetrating into the pancreas. But otherwise, if the patient doesn't have much of acid-like features like bloating, like heartburn, like burning epigastric pain, which is more when the stomach is empty and is reduced with food or antacid, it is suggestive that this is due to the peptic ulcer disease. But if these features are not very marked, any pain, epigastric or right upper quadrant radiating to back, usually suggests more of a gallbladder disease than an ulcer. The next, and here, you said malignancy. Malignancy chances are common.
No.
Chances are not really very, you said very common, but it's not really very common. But yes, well, possibility of malignancy are more than subjects without H. pylori. And of this malignancy, there's a special type of malignancy. Do you have any idea of that? Not adenocarcinoma, other malignancy, other type of malignancy in the stomach related to H. pylori? Chandan?
Sir,
have you ever heard of maltoma?
Yes, sir. Maltoma, yes.
In the stomach?
Yes, sir.
Hello, Chandan?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you, sir.
Maltoma is, yeah, mucus-associated lymphoma, a chronic inflammation of the stomach due to H. pylori leads to accumulation of the lymphocytes in the gastric mucosa. And if it is prolonged, it's chronically, then over a period of time, there may be what is called maltoma or mucus-associated lymphoma of stomach. And this is important because many of the maltomas, gastric maltomas, are actually cured when you control the H. pylori. That is one.
Yes.
Okay, then.
Okay. So I have
Anything
some
else?
observations on your presentation. You said H. pylori mechanism, Dr. Acharya has also added to that. But you should keep in mind one factor in H. pylori infection is it can cause hyperacidity also. How it does?
Yes.
The ammonia in the gastric antral area causes stimulation of the antral area because of hypoacidity leading to increased gastrin. And this hypergastrinemia in H. pylori infection can cause hyperacidity and aggravate the ulcer. That is one. Second is, you said about NSAIDs causing peptic ulcer disease. But you have not mentioned that apart from the standard NSAIDs, there is another group of patients who takes low dose of aspirin. And this low dose of aspirin is also an important factor. And it has been observed that if you give this patient PPI, these are the patients who are very responsive to PPI, and patient can continue this low dose aspirin with PPI. And second is, you said in Jollingen syndrome, the ulcer is malignant. No. In Jollingen syndrome, ulcer is not malignant. The ulcer is benign, but these are intractable ulcer. These ulcer occurs in different sites and very difficult to treat. So the ulcer is not malignant. Ulcer is benign. Yes.
Professor sir, I think he wanted to mention that many of the gastrinomas are malignant, not the ulcers.
Ajay, I feel
think,
that he said ulcers are
Chandan?
malignant. Okay.
Sir, yes, sir. Like
Ulcers are not
actually
malignant.
more
And
or
he has mentioned another thing
60%.
while describing ulcers in the stomach. He said there is gastric metaplasia. Gastric metaplasia does not occur in stomach; it occurs in duodenum.
Duodenum, yes.
H. pylori affects areas where there is acid, and duodenum, the pH of duodenum is alkaline. So H. pylori cannot affect duodenum directly. But when there is chronic acidity, that acid goes into the stomach, irritates the stomach, goes into the duodenum, irritates the duodenum, and there is gastric metaplasia of the duodenum. And only then H. pylori can affect that duodenum.
Colonize the duodenum, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And in the chart,
Colonize the duodenum.
in the chart, you see, there are some, this chart is better, I feel, in Bailey and Love. You see, hemorrhage.
Yes,
It's
sir.
not synonymous that gastric ulcer has hematemesis and duodenal ulcer has melena. Both and both.
Yes.
In fact, gastric ulcer more of hematemesis than melena, and duodenal ulcer more of melena than hematemesis. So both can happen in either case. Next is you have talked about this patient in presentation, that patient having a peptic ulcer may present with epigastric mass, may present with recent dyspepsia. But if you see, patient in 55 years recent dyspepsia, will our attention will more towards malignancy rather than a benign ulcer. Okay.
Yes.
Epigastric mass is not common in peptic ulcer disease unless you talk of a distended stomach itself. Okay. Epigastric mass will reflect our attention towards more of a malignant condition than a benign peptic ulcer disease. And another thing mentioned is nature of pain, periodical. It's not so. It is described that periodicity means patient has pain which persists for about 1 to 3 months, disappears, again it come back at a fixed interval. In duodenal ulcer disease, this periodicity is more marked than the gastric ulcer disease. Okay. So otherwise you have presented well. Fine. We have gone to the etiology and the
I think.
Yeah.
I think when you are presenting like peptic ulcer disease,
Yes.
You can divide your presentation into one presentation of an uncomplicated peptic ulcer disease and presentation due to complications.
Yeah. He has not mentioned.
I think that makes it easier.
Although someone will describe, but your presentation also include presentation with complications. So someone else is going to describe that. That is okay, but you should mention that patient may present complications also. Dr. Maiti, any comment? 1 minute. Dr. Sukumar Maiti?
That's it.
Okay, we can pass to the next presentation. Dr. Aram Jyoti from MR Bangalore Hospital, second year PGT, will describe the investigations and complications in patient with peptic ulcer disease. Dr. Jyoti, please.
Good morning, respected faculty. Today I am going to discuss a topic on investigations and complications of peptic ulcer disease. I am myself Dr. Jyoti, second year DNB resident from MR Bangalore Hospital. And whenever the patient comes to with alarming symptoms, as earlier discussed, with weight loss, dysphagia, and bleeding, patient has to be investigated. And coming to the investigations, upper gastrointestinal radiography. Diagnosis of peptic ulcer by radiography requires the demonstration of barium within the ulcer crater, which is usually round or oval and may or may not be surrounded by edema. Barium meal study is useful to determine the location, depth of penetration of ulcer, and extent of deformation from chronic fibrosis. With the usage of single contrast, 50% of ulcers are missed. So there comes a double contrast study where you can detect 80 to 90% of cases. In this picture, the ulcer crater projects beyond the lumen of the ulcer, and in the barium meal X-ray of showing the deformed or absence of duodenal cap. In case of chronic cases, appearance of trifoliate duodenum is due to secondary duodenal diverticula, which occurs as a result of scarring of ulcer. This is another picture showing the gastric ulcers and the duodenal ulcer. When you suspect an ulcer, it has to be further investigated and has to be biopsied. And the most common causes are H. pylori testing, which can't be done with a barium radiography. So it has been replaced by upper GI endoscopy now. Coming to the upper GI endoscopy, flexible endoscopy, which is the gold standard investigation, and it is more sensitive than contrast radiology and assessment of majority of gastroduodenal conditions. Coming to this one, whenever going to upper GI endoscopy, every part wherever abnormal lesions are there must be biopsied. Whenever passing through the retro U manual has to be done to see the front GE junctions, and any abnormalities has to be biopsied. In the case of in any gastritis, the antrum level has to be biopsied and has to send for rapid urease test to assess for H. pylori. While if any in the duodenum, entire first part has to be seen. In the case of near pre-pyloric and pyloric spinal, much attention has to be given because and assessed for the chronic duodenal ulceration also. If any earlier gastroenterostomy was done, both loops of the stoma has to be seen. If any irregular masses and heaped up margins, and has to be biopsied. This is a picture showing the gastric ulcer in benign gastric ulcer, and the second picture showing the duodenal ulcer in the pulse. Coming to the H. pylori testing, it has both non-invasive and invasive. Gold standard for is the mucosal biopsy during upper GI endoscopy. It has to be either urease test or HP test. Urease test, in this, the mucosal biopsy specimen has to be dipped in the phenol red solution, as it has the ability to produce ammonia, which is alkaline. It changes the color, and you will get the test in within 1 hour. And for monitoring treatment efficacy and the eradication, stool antigen test and urea breath test are more. Non-invasive tests are serology, urea breath test, and stool antigen test. Serology is sensitive, but it remains positive even after eradication of 1 year. So urea breath test and stool antigen tests are more sensitive than the serology test. In invasive test, urease assay and HP testing can assess severity, and culture the report will come in 3 to 5 days, and we can assess the antibiotic sensitivity also. Here's a picture showing the 40 carbon labeled urea, which when patient drinks, it enters into the stomach, where if H. pylori is present, it will degrade the urease. With the urease enzyme, it will degrade urea and produce ammonia and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets released into expelled in the air. Other investigations are serum gastrin and serum calcium and gastric acid analysis. Gastric acid analysis are rarely done nowadays. Serum gastrin and serum calcium are done in rare cases like in intractable ulcers and recurrent ulcers, where suspecting the gastrinomas and hyperparathyroidism. Coming to the complications in a decreasing frequency, bleeding, perforation, gastric outlet obstruction, and intractable peptic ulcers. Coming to the hemorrhage, annual incidence is 1 in 1,000. Most common is the most non-vessel bleeding. 70% is attributed to peptic ulcer disease. Most common complication of peptic ulcer disease is 5 to 20% more with the duodenal ulcer. Duodenal ulcers mostly present with hematemesis or melena, and the most commonly perforates, it bleeds posteriorly. It's most common is the gastroduodenal artery, where gastric ulcers, depending on the location of the ulcer, larger vessels will be inward. And most of the patients who are present in the upper GI, 75% of patients will heal spontaneously, will control spontaneously, and 1/4 of the patients needs further assessment. To predict the risk of rebleeding and mortality, several scores have been created. Most common the Blatchford and Rackle scores. Blatchford scores, it predicts the need for therapeutic intervention, whether patient needs transfusion or endoscopy or surgery, and it's a screening tool for determining patients who are at risk for serious bleeding and initial presentation. It includes the parameters: blood urea nitrogen, hemoglobin, and systolic blood pressures. Others are heart rate, melena, syncope, hepatic disease, and cardiac failure. Total score maximum is 23, and patients with scores above are considered to be at high risk. Coming to the Rackle score, it includes clinical variants and findings of initial upper endoscopy. With the only clinical scores, age, shock, and comorbidity. Score less than 3 carries a good prognosis. When after including the upper GI endoscopy, score more than 8 carries the high risk of mortality. It predicts the risk of rebleeding and inpatient in-hospital mortality. And it's also helpful in determining whether a surgical intervention may be required after the patient has been initially resuscitated and evaluated. When After the patient has been stabilized, early endoscopy has to be done, and the most commonly used classification is Forest classification. In this, 1A is the active spurting, and 1B oozing from the ulcer base, and 2A is a visible vessel, 2B they are showing adherent clot, and 2C black spots, and 3 is the clean ulcer base. 1 and 1B, 2A are associated with the high risk patient, and 2B, 2C, and 3 are the low risk conditions. Upper GI flexibility is best procedure for diagnosis source and also for therapeutic functions, and it's most commonly used. Coming to perforation, 5 to 10% of the peptic ulcer disease suffer perforation. Highest mortality rate is about 15%. Most common site of perforation is the anterior aspect of duodenum and anterior gastric ulcer, institutional gastric ulcer. Clinical features: elderly patients who are on chronic acid present with a sudden onset epigastric pain, usually due to chemical. Initially, it is chemical peritonitis. In later, it develops bacterial peritonitis. Sometimes patient may feel pain in the right iliac fossa due to fluid draining the paracolic gutter, Valentine syndrome, making the diagnosis suspicious. And on examination, patient is dehydrated, tachycardic, and hypotensive, and running the temperature and decreased urine output. On examination, abdomen, tenderness, rebound tenderness, and you will see the guarding and rigidity. And most investigation, straight extract abdomen will diagnose 80% of the pneumoperineum. CT is accurate, but serum amylase to be performed to rule out, not to exclude, but to assess the pancreatitis also. Next comes the gastric outlet obstruction. Most common cause gastric cancer and pyloric stenosis due secondary to peptic ulcer. Earlier it is due to pyloric stenosis, but now it has been replaced by gastric cancers. Which has clinical features are patient complaints of non-bilious projectile vomiting mixed with the undigested food particles and complaints of weight loss. On examination, patient feels unwell, dehydrated, and anemic will be there. On examination, distended stomach, visible gastric peritonitis, peristalsis, and suction splash will be there. When patient comes with a gastric outlet obstruction, metabolic effects are hypokalemic, hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis with paradoxical ischemia. It is due to whenever patient vomiting, the gastric contains acid and hydrogen and chloride ions are lost in the vomiting. So patient is hypochloremic and alkalosis. Initially, sodium and potassium are maintained, but as the patient is chronically vomiting, patient may get dehydrated and renin-angiotensin system will get activated. To compensate that, potassium and hydrogen get excreted, leading to paradoxical aciduria. Investigations are barium series, upper GI endoscopy, and CT of the abdomen. Intractable peptic ulcer disease, it's defined as failure of an ulcer to heal after initial trial of 8 to 12 weeks of therapy, or if patient's relapse after therapy has been discontinued. Unusual for duodenal ulcer disease, benign gastric ulcers that persist must be evaluated for malignancy. Whenever patient comes with non-healing, first you have to check for non-compliance of the patient and persistence any H. pylori infection, and you have to suspect malignancy in case of gastric ulcers and Zollinger gastrinomas in Zollinger-Ellison syndromes. Giant gastric ulcers, which are more than and equal to 2 centimeters, have high incidence of malignancy, that is 10%, more on lesser curvature. Gastric ulcers has the ability to penetrate into the contiguous structures such as spleen, pancreas, liver, and transverse colon. So it may mimics the unresectable malignancy, but it's not a peptic ulcer disease. Thank you.
Jyoti, I think you have been presenting quite frequently. That's good. Professor Maiti in the last session had mentioned that you shouldn't put in too many lines in a single slide. That you should keep in mind. And I have an impression that many of the lines are actually cut and pasted in the slides. Take care of that. Use your own words and these things. And when the patient comes with a history suggestive of peptic ulcer disease, you have mentioned barium contrast studies and upper GI endoscopy. That is all right when you know that the patient is actually having peptic ulcer disease. But in a general clinical scenario, you don't know whether the patient is having a peptic ulcer disease, a pancreatic problem, or a biliary problem, or something to do with the liver. So you should first rule out those things also. So anybody coming with a epigastric pain, with or without radiation to back, it is mandatory to ask for a amylase lipase. So these things you should keep in mind, that the patient has come to you without a fixed diagnosis with some symptoms. And when you are doing asking for investigations, it is to confirm your own clinical diagnosis as well as to rule out other differential diagnoses. So those investigations should also be included in your routine investigations. When the patient comes with a suspected peptic ulcer disease, apart from those investigations I have mentioned, the first investigation today is an upper GI endoscopy.
Yeah, you should start with that.
You
You start with that, yes.
Yeah, you can start with that. And nobody today asks for a contrast study unless the physician suspect or the surgeon suspects some complication. That is better picked up in contrast studies and other things. So first is upper GI endoscopy. Whenever the clinical diagnosis is peptic ulcer disease, the endoscopist should do a H. pylori test also. And if there is an ulcer, multiple site biopsies from margin as well as from the floor. But you should mention those things, because many an endoscopist do not do those tests unless mentioned. So that is one thing. And regarding those complications, when a patient comes with complications, particularly perforation or bleeding, you should also, apart from the investigations that you have mentioned, you have the patient is in acute condition, and the patient is coming with an possibly with shock. So you should assess the patient from that side also. Say, for example, the patient is coming with massive bleeding, whether the patient is having the patient is having a concomitant liver disease, which is making, because you don't know the bleeding is coming from stomach, it may be from barracks also. So a liver function test. The other things, what was the urine output, what was the urea creatinine, what is its the patient's other general parameters, like an elderly patient, somebody has mentioned that these complications are occurring in an elderly age group nowadays. So whether this patient has comorbidities, whether the patient, what is his ECG, like a cardiac condition, renal condition, hepatic conditions. So you should mention those things also, particularly a patient presenting with acute abdomen or acute condition like peptic perforation or a bleeding. So you must do that. Regarding ZDS, the diagnosis of ZDS is very important, but it's difficult, because everybody knows the serum gastric is one thing that should be done. But unfortunately, the patient on peptic ulcer, every patient with peptic ulcer have certain elevation of the serum gastrin level. In the past, it has been, but even now, many surgeons suggest that PPIs should be stopped for 2 weeks before doing a serum gastrin. But the problem is that many patients, when with ZDS, when their PPIs were stopped, had complications like perforations. So diagnosis of ZDS is a bit difficult. In the form that you cannot stop PPI. If you have PPI, then there is a certain level of elevation of serum gastrin. So that is a little problem. The approach today is to do a serum gastrin level, fasting serum gastrin level for 3 days. If it is elevated, then you should do you have rightly mentioned possibly that the gastric acid secretion tests, the basic acid output and maximum acid outputs are not far from these days. But in case of ZDS, basic acid output is important. And when you see that in a patient who has not undergone a gastric resection, the basic aspirate from the stomach is 140 milliliter or more. A pH is less than 2, and there is a there is a gastric level of 15 milliequivalent, 15 picogram per milliliter. Or in a resected stomach, it's 5 milliequivalent per milliliter, and is increasing with and the provocative test with secretin or calcium is in favor of ZDS, then possibly this patient is having ZDS. The second part of diagnosis of ZDS is the patient is whether having a gastrinoma, and any gastrinoma 2.5 centimeter or more in size should be removed, because many of them are malignant. And so the second part of the diagnosis is to try to locate the exact site of the gastrinoma. You have any idea of Passaro's triangle or gastrinoma triangle?
Junction of cystic duct and CBD, and second and third part of duodenum, and the head and body of pancreas junction.
Very good, very good. And any investigation to look at the exact site of the gastrinoma?
Scintigraphy, somatosynthetic related scintigraphy based on the octreotide receptor.
Yeah, very good, very good. Somatostatin receptor scintigraphy, that is one, and that is usually combined with CT scan. Gadolinium, you can use contrast also, and you can use AMR scan also. And nowadays, laparoscopic ultrasonography, particularly in gastrinoma suspected in the pancreas, is very helpful. In fact, in many a time when gastrinoma has been suspected, and these investigations have pointed out that the site is in the pancreas or somewhere, and you have opened it, and the surgeon cannot find it. It's very difficult to find. The on-table para-operative ultrasonography is also very helpful. Dr. Saha.
Yes. And endoscopic ultrasonography for small pancreas.
Endoscopic ultrasonography for small things. Yes.
In fact, actually, Jyoti, you have described the complications. I agree that you have touched all, but I still find the chart depicting the Bayesian law is very good to have a view of complications. Where he has
really
described acute complications, bleeding, perforation, subacute complications, residual abscess, and third is chronic complications. So everything is there. So you can have an overview that these are the basic complications of peptic ulcer disease. And at least in gastric ulcer, we mentioned the malignancy, although the chance is very remote, less than 1%, but still that is one of the complications of gastric ulcer, not duodenal ulcer. Duodenal ulcer doesn't run malignant. Okay. Otherwise, you have gone through well. Okay, we can pass on the last topic.
Before,
just
Professor, yes, before going into the last case, I just want to mention there is a clinical test in gastric outlet obstruction. See, the patient coming with gastric outlet obstruction, not all patients require immediate surgery. So there is a clinical test to assess whether this patient is likely to go to need a surgery, emergency surgery or not. That is called the normal saline installation test. Even you put in through the Rice tube 750 milliliter of normal saline, wait for 30 minutes, and then aspirate. If the aspiration is more than 400 milliliter, then this patient is likely to need emergency surgery. This patient will not respond to conservative management for the time being. If it is less than 100 milliliter, the patient will not need emergency surgery. And between this 100 and 400 milliliter, it is indeterminate, may or may not respond to conservative surgery. Not many practice this bedside clinical test, but this is helpful.
Dr. Maiti wanted to say something.
Yes.
Dr. Maiti.
Yes, thank you. It was a very nice discussion. I want to make a comment that when a clinician suspects that it is a case of peptic ulcer disease, particularly in female, we should also think about the cholecystitis, and ultrasonography should be a investigation performed almost in all the cases to exclude the gallbladder disease. And also the triad, a student should always remember the Moynihan's triad, that the peptic ulcer disease, gallstone disease and appendicitis may coexist together, and that is called the Moynihan's triad. That may be asked sometimes in oral examination. And regarding the clinical presentation, we should always remember that the peptic ulcer disease, but due to the acid peptic indigestion, it is mainly, if it is in the stomach, it is mainly in the towards the lesser curvature at the gastric canal, and the ulcers which are present in the site of the greater curvature, those are mainly the malignant ulcer. And the students should also understand the difference between a giant benign ulcer of the stomach and a malignant ulcer. These things I want to make the comment.
Yeah, thank you. So actually in surgical cases, you always keep in mind any abdominal present in surgical case, you should keep in mind ultrasound is an investigation which is now described as extension of clinical examination. So ultrasound has to be there in all abdominal case evaluation. It will help diagnosis. It will help to exclude other disease, particularly hepatobiliary disease. Ultrasound scores over CT scan. So ultrasound has to be there in all abdominal case evaluation, and you describe always as a extension of clinical examination. Okay. So we pass on to the last topic.
Another comment I'd like to make,
Yeah.
Jyoti, you have mentioned the barium study, the contrast study as the investigation in peptic ulcer in some cases at least. But yes, that is true, particularly in cases of functional obstruction of the gastric outlet. The endoscopist can say that he could not negotiate the scope through the duodenum or through the pylorus, but that does not sometimes corroborate with the clinical findings. In those cases, when you are in doubt, for the functional study of the stomach, the contrast examination is very useful. Thank you.
This happens, yes. So the last part of the will be both medical and surgical management of peptic ulcer disease. Dr. Atiq Ahmed, second year junior resident from RKM Shahpudistan, will be presenting this topic. Dr. Ahmed, please.
Good morning, my teachers and my seniors and colleagues. I will be presenting management of peptic ulcer disease today. Coming to the management of peptic ulcer disease, medical management comprises of three parts. Firstly, anti-ulcer drugs that fall into three broad categories. The drugs that decrease acid level by decreasing secretion like PPI and H2 receptor antagonist. Drugs that decrease acid level by neutralization like antacids, and drugs that increases the mucosal protective barrier like sucralfate. Secondly, in case of peptic ulcer disease with H. pylori infection, focus of therapy is on eradication of the bacteria. And lastly, lifestyle modification, which includes cessation of smoking, stopping use of NSAIDs and aspirin wherever possible, and avoiding coffee and alcohol that promotes ulcer healing. Coming to antacids. Antacids are the oldest group of drug available for treatment of PUD. They react with gastric acid to form salt and thus reducing gastric pH. This is most effective when ingested 1 hour after a meal, and their transient efficacy due to rapid emptying if taken of empty stomach limits their use nowadays. Best buffer are magnesium antacids but can cause significant diarrhea. Sucralfate is aluminum salt of sulfated sucrose. It dissociates in acidic environment. Sucrose polymerizes and binds with the protein in the ulcer crater to produce a protective coating that lasts for 6 hours. Treatment for 4 to 6 weeks generally result in duodenal ulcer healing but is not much effective in gastric ulcers. H2 receptor antagonists are structurally similar to histamine. They all undergo hepatic metabolism and are excreted by kidneys, most potent being famotidine. Duodenal ulcer healing rates of 70 to 80% after 4 weeks of therapy and 80 to 90% after 8 weeks of therapy are achieved. Continuous infusion produces more uniform acid inhibition than intermittent dosing. Proton pump inhibitors are presently the primary therapy for PUD in presence or absence of H. pylori infection. These are the most potent anti-secretory agent and can negate all type of acid secretion from all type of secretagogues. They causes more rapid healing than H2 receptor antagonist, showing 85% recovery rates at 4 weeks and 96% at 8 weeks therapy. They require acidic environment within the gastric lumen to get activated, and hence should not be given in combination with H2 receptor antagonist or antacids. The treatment of H. pylori positive duodenal ulcer is generally done using a triple therapy. Most commonly used nowadays is CAP regime of clarithromycin, amoxicillin, and a PPI of choice. In case of penicillin allergy, metronidazole replaces amoxicillin, and if the patient is having clarithromycin resistance, tetracycline can be used. 20% of the cases come with refractory disease where quadruple therapy using Bismuth can be considered. Now coming to the management of complicated peptic duodenal ulcers, hemorrhage being the most common complication in duodenal ulcer, incidence being 1 out of 1,000, 70% of this non-variceal bleed is attributed to peptic ulcers, most of which stops spontaneously. Management is just like any other emergency. We establish large bore IV access and do a rapid restoration of intravascular volume using blood products or IV or fluid as and when required. Flexible upper GI endoscopy should be done within 24 hours to check whether there is active bleeding or not. If there is active bleeding, clipping or thermocoagulation as monotherapy or in conjunction with injection adrenaline or any other vasoconstrictor can be done. But injection adrenaline should not be used as a monotherapy. Patient to be monitored in ICU till bleeding stops. All high-risk patients to be placed on a PPI administered intravenously with an initial bolus followed by continuous infusion for at least 72 hours. Another approach being catheter-directed angiography and endovascular embolization can also be done. Indications of surgery being persistent bleeding and which renders the patient hemodynamically unstable, or the patient requiring ongoing blood transfusion of at least more than 6 units of PRVC. Surgery done is through abdomen is entered through upper midline incision. Anterior wall of the duodenal bulb is opened longitudinally after Coccus maneuver. Oversewing of the bleeding vessels is done, which is mainly the gastroduodenal artery by 3-point suture. Duodenotomy is closed transversely to avoid narrowing. Blatchford and Rockall clinical scores can be used to predict risk of rebleeding and also helps in predicting the need of therapeutic intervention. Perforation is a surgical emergency and requires immediate intervention. It's the most common location is the anterior wall of the first part of duodenum. If the defect is less than 1 centimeter, it can be closed primarily and buttressed with a well vascularized omentum. For larger ulcers or also with fibrotic edge that cannot be closed without tension, Gram patch repair with a tongue of healthy omentum can be performed. For very large perforations of more than 3 centimeter, defect can be closed by application of healthy tissue like omentum or a jejunal serosa from Roux-en-Y limb. In such cases, a pyloric exclusion is often required. Laparoscopic repair is also possible and appears to be a superior approach in patients with duodenal perforation who are hemodynamically stable. Gastric outlet obstruction from ulcer is nowadays rare, and in case of gastric outlet obstruction, one must always rule cancer. But if it occurs due to ulcer, endoscopic dilatation and H. pylori eradication are the mainstays of therapy. Median of 5 dilatations are required and shows that patients following a dilatation do not require surgery. Refractory obstruction is best managed with primary anthrectomy and reconstruction along with vagotomy. For intractable peptic duodenal ulcer, these are rare nowadays and are defined as a failure of ulcer to heal after an initial trial of 8 to 12 weeks of therapy, or if the patient relapses after therapy has been discontinued. For such cases, serum gastrin level should be determined to rule out gastrinoma and treated with an acid-reducing operations like truncal vagotomy, selective vagotomy, highly selective vagotomy with or without anthrectomy. Surgical surgical procedures for a peptic ulcer. Goal of operative ulcer therapy is to reduce the gastric acid secretion. It can be done by removing vagal stimulation via vagotomy or by removing gastrin-driven secretion via anthrectomy or both. Truncal vagotomy is the division of left and right vagus nerves above the hepatic and celiac branches. It should always be associated with a drainage procedure like Henke Mekulicz pyloroplasty or any type of gastroenterostomy. Selective vagotomy is when the main right and left vagus nerves are divided just distal to the hepatic and celiac branches. Pyloric drainage procedures are performed. Due to its higher ulcer recurrence rate, this procedure is abundant nowadays. Highly selective or parietal cell vagotomy, only the branches of vagus supplying the acid-producing portion within the corpus and fundus are divided. Division is carried out till 7 centimeter proximal to the pylorus and at least 5 centimeter proximal to the gastroesophageal junction. The picture shows the different types of vagotomies. Another surgical approach is truncal vagotomy combined with anthrectomy. Anthrectomy is more commonly performed for gastric ulcers. It is more effective in reducing acid secretion and recurrence. Requires after anthrectomy, obviously the patient requires a GI continuity of surgery, which can be achieved by Billroth 1, Billroth 2 or Roux-en-Y reconstruction. For management of gastric ulcers, types of gastric ulcers has already been explained before. Type 1 ulcers, which are the most common type and are situated on the incisura. Here, malignancy is a major concern for this type of ulcers. Excision of the non-healing ulcer is necessary and can be achieved by wedge resection or sometimes distal gastrectomy. Type 2 and type 3 ulcers, which are associated with increased acid secretion, should focus surgery of this intractable disease should focus on acid reduction. Here, distal gastrectomy along with a truncal vagotomy can be done. Some advise laparoscopic parietal cell vagotomy as the first line approach and reserve resection for patients who develop recurrence. Type 4 ulcers for surgical treatment depends on the ulcer size, its location, that is distance from the gastroesophageal junction, and degree of the surrounding inflammation. If it is located within 2 to 5 centimeter from the gastroesophageal junction, Sendis procedure is done, followed by end-to-end gastroduodenostomy or gastrojejunostomy. Depending on the location of type 4 gastric ulcer, different surgical procedures are shown in this figure. For bleeding gastric ulcer, the initial management is same as duodenal ulcer. Attempt should be made to control bleeding endoscopically. Biopsies to be taken for detection of H. pylori or malignancy. If bleeding cannot be controlled, then surgical excision of the ulcer is required, with or without vagotomy, depending on the cause. For perforated gastric ulcer type 1, if the patient is in stable condition, a distal gastrectomy should be done with Billroth 1. If unstable, the simple patching of the perforation with biopsy is done. But in such cases, regular endoscopic follow-up should be done to see how the healing is progressing. For perforated type 2 and type 3 ulcers, simple patch repair with or without truncal vagotomy and pyloroplasty is done, and this depends on the status of the patient. Giant gastric ulcers is already defined before, are ulcers which are diameter more than 2 centimeters, more than equal to 2 centimeters. They are present usually on the lesser curvature, have a higher incidence of malignancy, and this risk increases with increasing size of the ulcer. For complications they generally respond to medical therapy, but for those who develop complications or failure to heal, gastrectomy including ulcer bed is done, with vagotomy reserved only for type 2 and type 3 ulcers. Zollinger-Ellison syndrome is a triad of severe PUD, gastric acid hypersecretion, and non-beta islet cell tumor of the pancreas. We do CT scan or SRS to locate for diagnosis of diagnosis and localize the gastrinoma. If localized gastrinoma is present, it should be resected following oncologic principles. And if there is tumor recurrence or metastatic disease, then it can be treated using chemotherapy. The treatment of choice being streptozocin along with 5-fluorouracil and doxorubicin and /or doxorubicin. Now, different post-gastrectomy syndromes are dumping syndrome, metabolic disturbances, afferent loop syndrome, afferent loop obstruction, alkaline reflux gastritis, and gastric atony. Thank you.
Okay.
That's different.
Yeah.
Atik.
Yes.
You have mentioned about the H. pylori eradication, lifestyle adjustments, etc.
Yes.
One often, and you have mentioned that caffeine is a factor that has to be taken care of. One often forgets that common cold drinks have a lot of caffeine in it. So along with alcohol and tobacco, these cold drinks should also be should not be continued in a known patient with peptic ulcer disease. And regarding H. pylori eradication, the drugs you have mentioned are okay.
Amoxicillin and
the problem is these drugs being in use for a long time. Some of these drugs are becoming showing this H. pylori. Many strains of H. pylori are showing resistance to a few of these drugs like azithromycin, clarithromycin, and also metronidazole. So the alternatives you have to keep in mind. Tetracyclines, the 5-fluoroquinolones, particularly levofloxacin, etc., have been used in place of clarithromycin or amoxicillin or metronidazole. And bismuth subcitrate has gone into a little disrepute nowadays. Not many are using this bismuth. And there is something, particularly those patients who cannot tolerate all 3 or 4 drugs at a time, there is a new approach has come of sequential management of H. pylori, sequential antibiotics. You use a PPI with amoxicillin, and then for 10 days or 14 days, and then you switch over to another group of drugs, but never a single drug, and always with a PPI. And thirdly, after stopping the antibiotics, one should continue the PPIs for at least 6 to 8 weeks. Many of these patients, and thirdly, one must keep in mind at this moment that ideally all patients after cessation of this drug therapy should make sure that H. pylori has really been eradicated. The best way to ensure that is a fecal antigen test, which is quick and less costly. But unfortunately, in Calcutta, possibly this is not available. So we have to again go in and depend on the upper GI endoscopy. Anyway, so that is this. And thirdly, the surgical operations. The surgical operations after the advent of PPIs are not really seen these days. In earlier periods when PPIs were not there and H2 blockers are coming in, the maximum number of major abdominal operations in every center was a acid reducing procedure in peptic ulcer disease along with a drainage procedure. And truncal vagotomy gastrojejunostomy was the most commonest. And the gradually this truncal vagotomy gave into in good centers highly selective vagotomies, and highly selective vagotomies, since the incidence of instead of its advantages, the incidence of recurrence of ulcer was quite high, up to 10% or even more in certain centers. It was not very popular. And the third, or should I say fourth option was there, truncal, not really truncal vagotomy. It's a posterior truncal vagotomy and anterior seromyotomy. And many of the laparoscopic surgeons who are doing peptic ulcer surgery, surgery for peptic ulcer disease are now doing this posterior truncal vagotomy along with anterior seromyotomy also. But in spite of PPIs, the surgery for peptic ulcer disease is not very common today, but the surgery for its complications like a gastric outlet obstruction or a bleeding peptic ulcer or a perforation has not gone down as expected with PPI. So surgeries for these complications are there, and whenever possible, along with the emergency procedures, if the situation permits, acid reducing surgery plus minus a drainage procedure should be done nowadays, because many surgeons think, because many of these patients actually need anti-H. pylori therapy for pretty long time, often for the rest of the life. And a definitive procedure, a definitive anti-secretory procedure is better than continuing this thing. This is one opinion. This is one opinion.
Yeah.
And regarding, you have mentioned Graham's patch. And before that, you mentioned also the well-vascularized Graham patch. Actually, this is really not the case. Graham used, Roscoe Graham of Toronto, he used actually a free momental pedicle. And Silas Jones from UK, he actually used this vascularized pedicle from the Wentham in, I think, 1918. When Silas Jones used a vascularized pedicle, 8 years later, Graham used a non-vascularized free pedicle. Anyway, do you have any idea of management of a giant ulcer which cannot be closed, giant perforation which cannot be closed by this technique you have mentioned? Any idea? What are the options?
So we can do, based on the location of the giant ulcer, my treatment will vary, sir. If it's present high up, we have high up in the lesser curvature, we have to do a total gastrectomy along with esophagojejunostomy. If it's present on the lower side,
in the duodenum,
if in the duodenum, then we can do a gastrojejunostomy, sir.
Only gastrojejunostomy?
or do an we can do
No,
a
what
sub-
about the perforation? It will be there?
mentioned closer
will-
perforation, pylori exclusion. You have mentioned somewhere.
yes, sir.
Yeah. See, the options are, if you have not real expertise, if you are not experienced, the patient's condition is not good. A controlled
Yeah,
duodenal fistula
Yes, sir.
is what one should do, along with drainage placed in the hepatorenal pouch of Morrison, and many surgeons also prefer to put a drain in the pelvis. Anyway, that is, if you are working in a good center with all the facilities, if you have experience, then the other options are duodenostomy, a antrectomy with a drainage procedure, along with the first part of duoden, including the perforated area. You can use a serosal patch over there. You can do a Roux-en-Y duodenojejunostomy. These are the other options. But the simple option, which particularly for the younger surgeons who do not have much experience, is a controlled duodenal fistula along with drains. And if there is no distal obstruction, keep the drain for 6 to 8 weeks, maintain nutrition, if necessary, by feeding jejunostomy. And after 6 to 8 weeks, it will heal, and you can take out the tube. That is about duodenal ulcer. And you have rightly mentioned about 3-point suturing the bleeding vessels, a branch of the gastroduodenal artery possibly. But while doing that, you should also keep in mind that right behind that is a bile duct. So the bile should not be too deep, because otherwise you will include the terminal part of the bile duct there. What about gastric ulcers?
Yes, sir.
Bleeding gastric ulcer?
So bleeding gastric ulcer is first we'll do first we'll
Same
resuscitate the
procedure.
patient.
You wander on the vessel. If you see if you can see the bleeding vessels. Suppose there is a adhesion, a penetrating ulcer in the posterior gastric wall, leading to adhesion with the pancreas and bleeding from splenic vein. What do you do?
So we have to do exploratory laparotomy, sir. And
Yes, always exploratory. Don't try to control it endoscopically. Don't try to control it endoscopically. Suppose there are multiple site erosions, bleeding. What are the options? Endoscopic options?
we can do thermocoagulation, sir. Clipping of the thermocoagulation and clipping.
Thermocoagulation by
Argon plasma.
Itaprobe,
Yes, sir.
bipolar. And if there is a diffuse oozing, you can use APC also, argon plasma coagulator. Argon plasma coagulator. In the management of ulcer, conservative management of ulcer, you have possibly missed, or maybe I have missed, the use of misoprostol,
Yes, sir.
prostaglandin inhibitor, which has some role in preventing as well as treating stress ulcers. But in an established peptic ulcer, misoprostol doesn't have much of a role. Main important role is PPIs as well as H. pylori eradication, stoppage of NSAIDs, aspirin, and other things. The persons who need long-term non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents, the ibuprofen or diclofenac or this naproxen may be replaced by etoticoxib or things like that, which acts on the mainly on the type 1 receptors rather than type 2 receptors. Type 2 receptors are the culprit for bleeding and peptic ulcer disease. Cyclooxygenase pathway. This acts to the cyclooxygenase pathways. Professor Shaha.
Yeah, yes. Actually, you have gone through all the options of treatment, but I would have preferred that you touch a little on the history of evolution of peptic ulcer disease surgery. Because if you go
Yeah.
through this history, you'll find that the first surgery that was done for peptic ulcer was a gastrojejunectomy, and a lot of people has healed with gastrojejunectomy. Subsequent on follow-up, patient started realizing that they are the patient who has higher incidence of marginal ulcer. Then comes the evolution of vagotomy, because people started realizing that some acid-reducing surgery has to be done, and then it started with truncal vagotomy, selective vagotomy, highly selective vagotomy, and modification of highly selective vagotomy in the form of Black and Hill modification or Taylor modification that Dr. Acharya has touched. So you should also have some idea about how the surgery has evolved over the period of years. Okay. So otherwise, we have discussed all the part of peptic ulcer surgery. Any question from the audience?
Except the complications of surgery.
Yeah. Constantly, I have not discussed. Any
Yes,
question
sir.
from the audience? Dr. Maiti?
Yes,
comment.
very nice presentation. And one comment I like to make, in our days, post-graduation days, one favorite question in theory was that evolution of gastric surgery. And this is my comment in extension to Professor Saha's comment. Because if you do not study the evolution of gastric surgery, you will miss so many things. And that was a very popular theory questions. And regarding the treatment of acid peptic ulcer disease or peptic ulcer syndrome, there are so many medicines, pharmacological treatment, but two things we should remember. One is the anxiolytic, because anxiety is one of the predisposing factor for the peptic ulcer disease, stress. So anxiolytic agent is often added by the clinician. And another thing we should remember, that because of the presence of the ulcer, there is spasm. So antispasmodics, in the suppose many popular drugs in the market is the Librax, Pasril. These are the drugs which is the combination of anxiolytic as well as the antispasmodic. That thing should be remembered. And my comment, the final comment to Atik. Atik, you have said so many things in details, but same thing as a comment made already by the Professor Acharya is the making of slides.
Yeah.
Your slides quality is too poor, and we should give adequate time in preparing the slides in the subsequent time. For example, I am just mentioning when you are presenting a slide on the management of the hemorrhage from a peptic ulcer, you have mentioned one of the point is catheter directed angiography and embolization could also be done. You see, this catheterization directed angiography, it is superfluous, and could also be done is superfluous. You can write only embolization.
And then
Because
describe.
You cannot do embolization without angiography.
Actually, what they are doing is copy and paste.
No,
This
you
should
have to-
never be done either in your thesis or in your slides or in any presentation.
Try to
Yeah,
make
just
the
copying
points in
and
bullet.
pasting.
Make the points in bullet and put a line. Let the audience think about it, and you start describing. Don't write the whole paragraph.
Actually, from the slides, the audience will see the message what you are giving, and they will try to think what you like to say, and your voice will elaborate everything.
Yeah.
You will just expand what is presented in the slide. That should be your, maybe, your idea.
Moreover, what you have presented in your slides are actually in the books, and everybody has access to books. They do not want to show this in your slide presentation. They just have to get an idea of overall idea about
salient
the
points.
disease,
Salient points
salient
and,
points, and they say 1 hour discussion. Everybody want to finish this discussion. I mean, end this discussion. And after all, think, yes, I'm benefited from this discussion because I have a good idea, good overall idea about what the disease is, how it can be diagnosed, and how it can be managed. So try to be specific on those aspects and be brief. Don't read out verbatim what is there in the book and which you have pasted in your slides.
Okay.
Basic
It's
directive,
9:45.
one thing, basic directive about the preparing of slides, there should be only 6 lines,
Yes.
and the sentence should be not more than 6 words. Okay, so you try to prepare the slides in that
They'll
way.
improve, sure.
Words and 6
So we end today, and I request all to join on Tuesday. Dr. Chintamani has agreed to take a class on Tuesday, and that will be a case discussion on breast cancer. So I request all to join by 8:30. on
Professor
Tuesday.
Saha,
Yes.
just a comment.
Yes.
The last comment
Yes.
regarding Bill Roth. When Bill Roth this Billroth's operation was first done in a patient with a gastric outlet obstruction due to advanced malignancy. And Billroth thought that this patient is going to die. So he did a gastrojejunostomy just above this ulcer, this malignant ulcer.
Yeah.
But luckily the patient survived for quite pretty long time. And then he went in again and resected the malignant ulcer. So that is how this Billroth operation come into practice.
Yeah.
They understood that this could be done in benign ulcers also. That is part of the history, interesting history. It was not for a benign ulcer, it's for a malignant and in 2 stages.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
Yes, sir.
Say goodbye. Next we join on next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Thank you.